嗱，如果可以嘅話咧，請你打開聖經嘅以斯拉記第2章。
So if you have your Bible with you, please turn to the Old Testament, the book of Ezra, chapter 2.
嗱，我哋因為2月份堂慶咧，所以我哋冇講以斯拉，咁我哋就喺3月份裏邊咧，我哋睇翻以斯拉整章嘅第2章。
So certainly, we because of the church anniversary, so we didn't kind of like study chapters, in the book of Ezra. So in March now today, so we're going to kind of study that.
我唔知你每一日咧，你需唔需要預備煮你嘅飯餸咧？
So I'm not sure whether you're the one responsible for making meals.
你呢度邊個要煮飯嘅？舉手啊！
Please raise your hand if you're the one who needs to cook for your family.
你唔煮你買咧？
So maybe if you don't cook, maybe you would purchase.
通常每一晚咧，你食乜嘢嘅時候有2個嘅取向啊。
Certainly every day, every night you plan your meal that, there are 2 choices perhaps.
一係咧，你嗰晚食乜嘢就睇下你個雪櫃有乜嘢，你就食乜嘢，就煮乜嘢。
Perhaps, yeah, one would be whatever, that you have in the fridge, that would decide what meal, you're going to cook for the night.
咁有第2種人嘅時候咧，佢就我哋就諗下今晚我想食乜嘢咧，跟住就去買乜嘢，就自己預備嗰晚嘅飯菜。
The second type would be you're thinking about what am I going to eat? What do I want to eat tonight? Then you would go out to the market and shop for all the things you need to make your meal for the evening.
你係屬於邊種咧？
What type of person are you?
兩種都有唔同嘅情況，第一種可能為生活、為生存而去進食啊。第二樣嘅時候，可能我諗突然之間好想食乜嘢好有興趣去買去煮去享受你嘅生活。
So you can tell like the 2 types, like perhaps the first type would be like mainly for survival, whatever you have. The second type would be you really look to your taste bud, your interest, and you would actually go out to get the food to make the meal that, you would cook and enjoy eating.
咁其實兩個無論你邊一個嘅取向，你都係為咗唔想肚餓，係咪？
So regardless of like both types, that, the probably main purpose would be you don't want to stay hungry.
可能你會生存，但係你個內容唔同。
Perhaps, you may be able to survive, but, the content, of your life or of your living, may be very different.
你嘅人生
And your life?
喺個環境好啦，要讀書，讀完書出嚟揾嘢做，試下揾嘢做，跟住咁結婚生仔，你嘅人生係咁樣咧？定係你有你嘅目標，你有你嘅理想，你為你嘅理想而去邁進咧？
So draw a parallel to your life? What are you? Are you like just going to school, maybe complete school, get a job, maybe, have a partner, get married, have kids, or on the other hand, you're actually pursuing, your intention and your interest and putting in effort in your life that way.
兩個都係活緊你嘅人生，但可能你嘅內容、你嘅取向。 可能你嘅享受亦都唔同。
Both types would be living your life, but definitely, the content of your life, would be very different, isn't it?
當你計劃你嘅人生嘅時候，我哋作為基督徒，我哋應該點樣去做呢？
So as you go about to plan your life as Christians, what are you going to do?
當我哋去計劃我哋嘅人生，請你唔好忘記一樣嘢，我哋去問一問上帝，你喺我嘅人生嘅裏邊，你嘅計劃、你嘅心意係乜嘢？
So certainly as Christians, as you plan your life, perhaps never to leave out, what is God's plan like for my life anyhow?
以斯拉記係記載一班被擄到巴比倫70年，佢哋準備回歸嘅人去而寫嘅。
Certainly, the book of Ezra was written for those Israelites who were first exiled to Babylon. Now that they were, just about ready to be returned to their homeland.
佢哋返去原居地，佢哋唔返去原居地，佢哋都係生活緊。
Certainly, whether they returned to their native land or not, they were living life then.
點解當時一班嘅以色列人可以願意離開巴比倫去返原居地？
So why would this group of Israelites somehow decided to want to return to their homeland from the land of exile, Babylon?
喺第一章嘅裏邊嘅時候，我哋從一個嘅角度去睇，佢哋體會到上帝嘅心意，所以佢哋願意去。
So apparently from chapter 1, the Israelites, they truly discerned the will of God. So they were determined and motivated to uplift themselves and return to their homeland.
一個外邦嘅王古列去揾準佢哋去返佢哋嘅原居地。
And a Gentile king agreed, with their plan that gave them permission to return to their homeland.
唔係人可以做到，而係神喺人心裏邊動工。
And definitely not the work of men, but indeed God stirred, the hearts of men and allowed them to be able to achieve that.
嗱，我哋唔會再重複講咁 detail， 但係勾畫等你大家記得。如果你唔記得就你睇翻1月份嘅第一嘅星期嘅講道。
So certainly we're not going to kind of delve into further details, but I encourage you, if you don't remember, please return to the January sermon when we talked about the background of this.
去到第二章，我哋要處理第二個嘅問題。
So as we come to chapter 2, a second issue, for us to be to tackle.
人知道上帝嘅心意，唔等於人會行喺上帝嘅心意裏邊。
So certainly knowing God's will doesn't automatically mean that the person, would do and actualize God's will.
所以今日我哋去祈求上帝嘅心意，我哋更加要祈求上帝俾我有力量，願意順服行喺你嘅心意，呢個先至夠完美。
So today, the lesson for all of us, would be not just knowing God's will, but to be able, to kind of put into action, to take steps, to take actions to fulfill God's will for us.
弟兄姊妹，當我哋靜一靜喺我哋嘅人生嘅當中，我相信大家都好期望，我哋願意知道上帝嘅心意。
So perhaps all of us, we expect and wish, that we truly understand God's will for us.
弟兄姊妹，但喺我哋咁耐嘅歷程，係咪淨係我哋已經係不斷上帝你嘅心意係乜嘢？上帝你嘅心意係乜嘢？可能上帝顯明個問題唔係上帝顯唔顯明，而係我哋有冇行出神嘅心意。
So all along, maybe, we have just been looking and searching for God's will. And in other words, we have neglected to actually, move forward, to the place that, have we, actualized, have we taken actions ourselves, to walk into the will of God.
以斯拉記第1章當時嗰班以色列人回歸嘅以色列人好清楚知道自己要返去重建聖殿。
So certainly from chapter 1, in the book of Ezra, the Israelites then, they knew, they fully understood and determined that, they wanted, to return to their native land.
當佢哋返到去嘅時候，第2章佢哋點樣去預備去重建聖殿，即刻落實嘅工作。
So once returned to their native land, these Israelites, right away, mobilized themselves to prepare for the rebuilding of the temple of God.
嗱，今日我哋嘗試從第2章嘅裏邊去睇下當時嘅以色列人，佢有邊幾方面上邊去嘅預備。
So from chapter 2 today, we're going to kind of learn from the Israelites that, once returned, how were they going to kind of prepare for the rebuilding of God's temple?
同樣地，我哋喺當中攞到一啲嘅原則，我哋點樣應用喺我哋嘅人生？當我哋要去實踐神自己嘅心意，我哋需要點樣去預備自己？
So certainly, we're going to kind of take lessons from the Israelites and maybe learning about the principle as we plan our life. What are some of the things we have to adhere to such that we continue to follow the will of God in our life?
嗱，我邀請大家一齊讀一讀第一節，請留心。
So I encourage you to read with me in unison verse 1.
巴比倫王尼
These are the
布
people of the province
從前擄到
came
巴
up
比
from
倫
the
之猶
captivity
大
of the
省嘅
exiles
人，
whom
現在他們
Nebuchadnezzar,
嘅
king of
子孫
Babylon,
從
had
被
taken
擄之
captive.
地回耶路撒冷和猶大，各歸本色。嗱，喺呢一度嘅時候咧，第一二節嘅時候開始做咗一個嘅引言。
Certainly, you can see that chapter 2 of Ezra, verses 1 and 2, it was an introduction, kind of like, prologue, like leading into, like, their experience.
佢喺呢個引言裏邊咧，喺呢一度開始強調當時嘅以色列人。
Certainly here, as you can see, it put some emphasis on describing the Israelites, who they were.
嗱，中文聖經比較好明顯地講咗一樣嘢俾我哋知道。
So from the Chinese version of the Bible, it really indicated, a special, some special emphasis.
嗱，佢哋我哋問一問啦，以色列人被擄到外邦幾耐啊？
So I would ask you, so the Israelites were captured and exiles to, Babylon for how many years?
幾多年？
70 years.
係啊，70年啊嘛，係咪 ？OK，
So
70年
altogether, 70 years.
啊，咁喺70年嘅時候咧，當時尼布甲尼撒擄到啲人將以色列人擄到巴比倫，而家翻翻嚟嘅時候，當中相隔幾耐啊？幾耐？
So when the king Nebuchadnezzar captured them, and then now that they are returning, so how many years do you think in between?
幾耐啊？70年咯。咁即係如果嗰陣時啱啱出世，翻去都70歲噶咯，係咪 ？OK。
So at least 70 years, right? If they were, some of them were born around that time, at time of capture, the person would have been already 70 years old.
可能當中有一啲嘅人係曾經見過聖殿，或者可能係佢哋嘅第二、第三代嘅人喺外邦裏邊出生嘅人。
So apparently, we can speculate that perhaps within this crowd, that they might have seen the temple of God, or, they could have been like the second or third generations of Israelites that, they were even born, in Babylon.
70年啊
，70 years.
已經落地生根㗎啦。
Perhaps, for them, they would have already, been quite settled in the land of Babylon.
你嚟咗加拿大幾耐？
So how many years have you migrated to Canada?
係啊，而家加拿大幾好啊，我都唔想走，係咪？
Well, perhaps you might say, hey, I'm settled here in Canada. This is so good. I don't want to leave.
係咪？翻去玩下好過，係咪？
So maybe, okay, I could just go back to my native land and just to have fun.
第二章一開始講到呢一班嘅人，佢哋離開已經落地生根嘅巴比倫，而家開始回歸去到以色列，翻到耶路撒冷。
So apparently in chapter 2, it described these group of Israelites. They picked themselves up, left Babylon, and returned to their native land, like Jerusalem.
聖經要話俾我聽，呢一班嘅人去做出呢一個決定，去行出呢一個嘅行動，實在唔容易嘅。
Certainly, the Bible truly depicted it was not easy, for the Israelites to kind of uplift themselves again and altogether return to their native land, Jerusalem.
佢哋會離開自己安舒嘅地方。
So apparently that meant they had to leave behind a place where they had settled in, maybe a place of comfort.
當中有大部分嘅人可能去返一個嘅地方，好似好熟悉，應該好熟悉，但係其實好陌生嘅地方。
So certainly maybe for a majority of them that, they would have left a place of familiarity, but returned to a place that to them seems somewhat strange or even new.
但係佢哋願意去。
But they were willing, they were determined.
唔單止係願意，而且佢哋真係去咗。
And certainly not only willing, but they actually packed up and went.
點解佢哋會咁做？
So perhaps you might ask, why would they want to do that?
如果我哋睇返第一章嘅時候，佢哋好清楚呢個係上帝嘅心意，以致驅使佢哋跳出佢哋嗰個 comfort zone，佢哋願意去實踐上帝嘅使命。
So apparently, they were so determined because from chapter 1, they knew for sure that it was God's will to want them to return to native land. That's why they had no hesitation. They packed up and then they took actions to return.
弟兄姊妹，當我哋信耶穌嘅時候，我哋知道我哋求主帶領我哋人生。
So certainly as Christians, once we accepted Christ into our life, we begged and we prayed for God to lead and guide our lives.
知道係一件事。
Knowing, it's one thing.
弟兄姊妹，你諗下你自己計劃你嘅人生，係你自己計劃緊，定係上帝去引導緊？
Perhaps a good question, for us to reflect would be, am I running my life or am I allowing God and to lead and guide my life along?
牧師，我知啊，我要為我嘅人生祈禱，求神帶領啊嘛。
So perhaps you might say, hey, I got to pray for the future of my life, and praying to God to lead and guide my life ahead.
係啊，我有擺喺禱告度啊。
Oh, certainly, I definitely, have put it pray for this, every day in my prayer.
當我哋今日睇呢班以色列人，佢哋話俾我哋聽第二個要思想嘅。
So certainly, as we study, from the paragraph today, from Ezra, that we're going to kind of meditate upon what it is, that we need to understand here.
當你祈禱求神帶領你嘅時候，你要問多一個問題嘅時候，喂，神帶領你係咪會咁樣做？
So certainly when you pray, and to God, to lead and guide your life, perhaps then you have to ask yourself, a second question, is this truly what God wanted me to do?
如果你唔係咁做，你唔好呃神又呃自己。
So certainly, if you don't do that, perhaps then, don't try to deceive yourself and God.
但係如果你真係咁做嘅時候，神好樂意去帶領你，你就準備點樣去回應緊神。
So certainly, if indeed, this is truly your understanding and your inspiration, this is fully from God, that you could just, get ready and prepare, to follow God's will.
而唔係將你自己人生停留啊！上帝，我想你知你嘅心意，而係你實踐緊上帝喺你人生裏邊嘅旨意，弟兄姊妹。
So instead of just knowing God's will for you, but indeed, you already know, and then you are actually preparing and picking yourself up to take action to follow God's will.
弟兄姊妹，我哋今年去睇以斯拉記嘅時候，我哋要喺以斯拉記嘅當中學啲嘅功課。
So certainly this year we picked the book of Ezra to study. There are definitely lessons for us to learn here.
當我哋話要去renovate，我哋去 develop 我哋呢個地方嘅時候，我哋弟兄姊妹，我哋已經睇到神自己開咗好多個路，我哋點樣去預備？而家我哋去到呢個 stage。
So certainly, this for the last few years, as we talked about church renovation, certainly now we have come to the point that we have to engage, further, by taking actions.
唔再重複啦。你要問嘅時候，塊地本來要俾錢唔使錢可以有嘅，跟住你明嗎？睇到上帝嘅心意，我哋點樣去回應佢？弟兄姊妹。
So certainly, looking back at, we, have inherited, these land, the building, without cause, that was a clear, indicator, from God, a message from him that, now we got to kind of move forward, with our plan.
我弟兄姊妹，如果我哋唔喺呢班以色列人學一個功課，我哋就好，你咪見咯，你有你見，我有繼續生活，我唔需要參與，我唔喺當中裏邊去投入，明嘛？你忽略咗好似當時嘅以色列人嗰個經歷。
So certainly, if there's a lesson for each one of us. Perhaps we could stay away and just say, oh, okay, yeah, go ahead, or on the other hand, there's a lesson for each one of us, to learn, from, the Israelites that now, we have reached a point that we got to kind of take actions to follow through with, what God, has inspired us to do in the first place.
當時嘅以色列人知道上帝嘅心意，佢就要願意離開去安舒嘅地方。
So the Israelites then fully understood the will of God. So therefore, they were so willing and determined and packed up and left a place of comfort, to move forward and back to their native land.
點解佢哋會有咁嘅改變，有咁嘅心志？
So why would they have such a strong will and commitment?
佢喺外邦都可以生活，點解要去咁做？點解要去搞咁多嘢去建殿呢？
So perhaps, they could have stay because, they had already settled, in the foreign land. And why would they have to engage in restarting something? And they had so much to do.
如果你留意以斯拉記、尼希米記記載當時回歸嘅以色列人，可以話喺歷史上，除咗約書亞記所記載嗰班以色列人咁生性之外，第二班生性咁熱心愛主嘅人，就係嗰陣時嘅以色列人。
So apparently, if you had a chance to kind of study and read from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, apparently learning about the Israelites. So historically, there were kind of two groups of Israelites that they had actually followed the will of God, So the first group would be at the time, of Joshua, when they had to leave the land and move on to the promised land. Now, here, we have reached, this group of Israelites that they loved God so much that they were willing and actually follow the will of God through.
點解佢哋咁熱心愛主？
So why would they love God so much?
因為佢哋好清楚點解佢哋會被擄到外邦。
Because they fully understood why, in the first place, they were captured and went on exile, to a foreign land, Babylon.
佢哋嘅始祖離棄上帝。
Because they understood their ancestors, had betrayed and angered God.
有咁宏偉嘅聖殿，佢哋唔識去珍惜。
So they used to, enjoy, such a glorious temple that they once built.
本來要享受神自己嘅祝福，而家變咗一種神嘅刑罰。
And they once, at least their ancestors for generations enjoy, the blessings from God. But now that, they had to suffer.
當時嘅以色列人去學到嘅功課。
So the Israelites, they actually learn from their ancestors, from history.
佢唔想再被刑罰啦。
They never, would want to be placed under the wrath and, the punishment and consequences from their actions.
佢睇到需要改變。
So they were fully aware that they needed to be transformed.
需要做一個真真正正嘅基督徒。
And certainly, needing, to live like a true
弟
Christian.
兄姊妹，喺
Brothers and
保
sisters.
羅喺以弗所書咁樣話，
Paul, in the book of Ephesians,
佢
once
從
said,
當時嘅基督徒，佢話你哋要脫去從前行為上嘅舊人，呢、個舊人係因私欲嘅迷惑漸漸變壞，又要將你嘅心志改換一新，並且穿上新人。這新人是照着神嘅形象做，有真理嘅仁義和聖潔。
So the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians truly encouraged Christians of the time by saying that you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desire, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds, to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness.
當保羅提醒當時嘅基督徒，點解你要信耶穌？
So Paul encouraged the Christians at the time and really make them to fully understand like why, they would want to become a
我
Christian.
唔想再活喺我自己嘅舊我裏邊。
Certainly encourage them never, to live in a former way of
我唔
life
想再被我自己嘅性格、我自己嘅私欲去再一次捆綁住自己。
and not to be bounded and be corrupted by their character kind of faults, and their deceitful desires.
但係當你信耶穌，你唔去改變，你仍然俾自己嘅舊我、自己嘅舊性格、自己嘅舊嘅習慣、價值觀去影響住自己。
And certainly, even though you claim to be a Christian, but indeed, very much so, still allowing your old self, your sinful nature, and all those deceitful desires to consume you, to bind you.
所以你會明白點解保羅要同一班基督徒講，你要心志改換一新。
So therefore, now you understand more fully why the Apostle Paul would encourage, Christian at the time that, hey, you got to be made new in the attitude of your minds.
但如果我哋信耶穌，我哋個個禮拜敬拜，但你冇心裏邊去改變你嘅生活，你改變去學習神嘅樣式，你冇改變㗎。
So even though, you might come every day, you would attend church activities, but without making new in the attitude of our minds, and that, to kind of follow the new self and to be more like God in his true righteousness and holiness, then we are being deceitful of ourselves and God.
更加你唔會行出上帝嘅心意。
So why wouldn't you, be walking, in the new will of God, which is for you?
所以喺呢段經文嘅裏邊提我哋第一樣，當我哋話要行出上帝嘅心意嘅時候，請我哋要第一樣嘢改變你自己嘅心志。
So perhaps as we claim that, we would take action and be willing to follow the will of God, there are a couple things that, we really have to be mindful of, like, first and foremost.
預備你嘅心志。
So definitely prepare your attitude.
當我哋繼續睇段經文，你會發現第二章寫咗好多嘅我哋可以形容為家譜或者一啲嘅人嘅情況。
So certainly, you probably, might be mindful in chapter 2 of the book of Ezra that you would see something like a genealogy record of the people.
以斯拉嘗試去勾畫當時回歸嘅人裏邊包括乜嘢人呢？
So Ezra, in his writing, wanted to kind of capture and outline these people these Israelites who return, and who are these people anyways?
你會嗱，我唔同你讀啊，因為太長啦啊。咁咪由大約係第3節去到第35節嘅時候咧，呢度形容到好多唔同嘅族長，跟住佢哋帶幾多嘅人，喺整體嚟講係講到當時以色列整體嘅百姓裏邊有幾多人。
So apparently from verse 3 to all the way to 35, like Ezra had make description of the Israelites who were returned. Apparently their tribe leader and these particular group of Israelites, what constituted them.
呢個係第一個嘅分類。
So this is, a first kind of like, division, so to speak.
第二個嘅 category 咧，佢哋係講到第36節去到嘅39節，講到祭司。
So in the first category, and the second category would be verse 36 to 39. Ezra spoke about the priests.
去到第40節嘅裏邊咧，係講到有利未人。
So up to verse 40, it mentioned the Levites.
祭司係侍奉神啦，利未也係侍奉神嘅人啦。
So the priests and the Levites, they were called, to serve God.
41節裏邊咧講到嗰啲歌唱嘅人。
So verse 41 mention the singers.
42節嘅時候咧講到嗰啲守門嘅人。
So certainly verse 42, those are mentioning of the gatekeepers.
43節到58節嘅講到一啲嘅叫做尼提寧。尼提寧人咧係講到當時尼提寧人係叫做電譯嘅。
So certainly from verse 43 all the way to 58, it mentioned these people in translation, they have a different name, but they are actually the temple servants.
咁我哋繼續睇你會留意第59節去到63節嘅時候咧，64節嘅時候咧，講到有一班嘅人咧，佢哋唔知道佢哋嘅背景啊，因為已經去到第幾代噶啦，佢哋揾唔到佢哋嘅族譜，所以呢班人咧叫做不明家族嘅一班人。
So the last group, somehow, they were identified as an unknown. So they were mentioned in verse 59 to all the way to 64.
咁65節嘅裏邊咧，形容到咧一個嘅總結咧，佢形容到裏邊當中佢哋嘅僕婢包括男與女。
And from 65 verse and on, Ezra capture, so there were men servants and maid servants among this group of return.
嗱，當我哋睇翻咁啲8個嘅分類啊。
So as we look at, these 8 categories of people,
你有冇睇到一個共通點？
What do you see? There seems to be some commonalities among these people.
呢班人翻去做乜嘢？
So apparently these group of Israelites, why would they return? What were they thinking?
呢班人全部翻去嘅時候，為咗將來重建聖殿之後，重建咗做咩啊？敬拜。Right?
So certainly, they were prepared. They were willing to return, and they were prepared to rebuild the temple of God.
冇百姓有祭司啊，唔掂啊？有百姓冇祭司咁又點啊？你明唔明啊？都
So certainly, you can see from the composition of the group. So there were definitely people, and there were priests as well, because if all people, had gone back, but without the priests, what good would it do?
有祭司日常嘅生活嘅聖殿嘅運作，邊個去負責啊？有敬拜嘅時候，祭司邊個去負責領唱啊？嘅守門邊個做招待啊？你明白喺呢一度唔通又喺佢哋有人嚟做招待？ 你會睇到嗰當時嗰形容嗰班嘅人係為咗咩啊？將來建好聖殿而去預備啊，明嗎？
So, in other words, this group of people, they share, one purpose, which was, they would return to their native land, they would rebuild God's temple, and once the temple, was built, that, there would be people who shared different tasks, like the priests, the Levites, the singer, gatekeepers, and they would be there to serve in the temple of God.
呢班人睇到我建造聖殿唔係淨係停喺呢度，將來下一步佢而家就要去作好預備。
So certainly, not only they had a purpose to build, to rebuild the temple of God, but they were actually preparing for once the temple was rebuilt, and what would they do?
以斯拉記記載呢啲人有乜嘢俾我哋學習到？
So certainly, the Ezra, he wrote about this. What was the lessons for us?
呢班人願意去作好預備。
So this group of Israelites, they were prepared, and they took actions to prepare themselves.
上帝知道，
And God was fully discerning and aware.
幾多人去知道？
And even how many people were actually there.
點解佢哋咁快建好聖殿，而帶俾當時以色列人一個咁大嘅復興？因為佢知道佢為乜嘢做，佢哋願意準備自己一齊嘅參與。
So why would and how could they rebuild the temple in such a fast kind of like manner? Because these group of people, they were fully discerning and aware of God's will. And then, they commit themselves, their attitude, and then they were willing to prepare themselves.
弟兄姊妹，今日我哋點嚟到上帝嘅面前嚟敬拜？我哋有咩嘅心意？係咪行緊神嘅心意？係咪同神嘅計劃一齊去？上帝計算緊。
So certainly today, as we look back at ourselves, and in our church rebuilding, are we aware of God's will? What kind of mentality, we have like at this point?
上帝好留意我哋嚟，我哋嘅心態，我哋點樣去回應緊上帝與否？上帝留意緊。
So certainly, God is fully aware of our hearts and our thoughts, and how He is discerning, how we're going to kind of respond, to this will of His, and how we're going to follow.
你話牧師你點知啊？
Perhaps you might question, like, Pastor, how would you know?
如果你咁樣問我嘅時候，你只可以應該問自己：上帝話咗俾你聽，點解你唔去揾啊？
So perhaps, instead of asking me, maybe, you would ask yourself that God already, had inspired you. Why, wouldn't you follow through?
啟示錄講到敬拜嘅時候，特別有一個天使攞根位置去量度，量度咩啊？量度聖殿，量度祭壇，量度殿中禮拜的人。
So certainly in Revelation, we once study that in chapter 11, that they were given a reed like a measuring rod and was to go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshipers there.
我哋係咪真係嚟到上帝面前去敬拜？上帝量度緊。
So certainly as we come before God to worship Him, that certainly, we have been measured.
你嚟到坐喺度嘅時候，你望住我啊，你個心諗緊乜嘢？上帝量度緊。
So certainly as you come today, sitting here to worship, God already, is measuring you.
你今日你聽，你係咪用心去聽？願有一個順服嘅心，上帝量度緊。
So certainly, as you come today, whether, you're listening with an intent, to obey, God is actually aware and it's measuring.
可能你同人講跟住你個內心裏邊可能有好大嘅對抗反彈，上帝量度緊。
And certainly, maybe, you are reacting to the message. There might be a little bit of like struggle inside, but certainly, God is fully aware of your struggles.
量度緊我哋今日係點樣預備好自己去敬拜神。
God is measuring, how we prepare ourselves to come into His fellowship and to worship Him.
神今日預備緊一班嘅人，將來去敬拜佢。
So God already, is preparing, for the group of people who will, in time to come in to worship Him.
今日我哋有冇唱詩，上帝量度緊。
So today, whether we have engaged, in singspiration, God is indeed measuring.
我哋唱詩，我哋係咪仲讚？上帝量度緊。
So certainly, God is measuring, are we kind of really singing, from our hearts? God is aware and measuring.
我哋侍奉，我哋係咪為咗神嘅榮耀？上帝量度緊。
So as we serve, are we serving to reveal the glory of God? God is measuring.
弟兄姊妹，我哋有冇預備將最好嘅獻過俾上帝？
Brother and sister, have we brought, our best, to come and serve, the Lord, to dedicate to Him?
最後，
At the end,
你會留意第66節去到第70節嘅時候，着咗一個咁樣嘅形容。
So in chapter 2 of Ezra, verses 66 to 70, there is some description.
66到67節嘅時候咧，講到佢哋馬匹有幾多，驢子有幾多，駱駝有幾多，驢有幾多。
So here, verses 66 and 67, there were Ezra mentioning, the number of horses, mules, camels, and donkeys that were in their ownership.
大約8000左右嘅牲畜。
So altogether, if you count, apparently they had about 8,000 animals, horses, mules, camels, and donkeys.
多唔多啊？
Was it a lot?
如果你一個人擁有嘅，梗係多啦。但係唔好忘記當時我差唔多成5萬幾人一齊擁有啊。
So perhaps if you own 8,000 animals, it was a lot. But at the time, remember, we read there were about 50,000 Israelites, that had returned. So maybe not a whole lot of animals among them.
呢啲係佢哋嘅生活代步嘅工具喎。
So apparently these animals were their means of transportation, of movement.
大約一個人幾多人擁有一個嘅牲畜啊？
So how many people you could divide them, so how many people would share, maybe one animal here, a horse or mule, donkey, camels?
6、7個人 share 一個。
So you do the math, maybe 6 or 7 people would only have access to one of these, animal that were with them.
無論你揸寶馬又好，大水牛又好，咁樣分喎。
So in our today's term, whether you're driving a BMW or a bigger vehicle, so that's what it
呢
is.
啲人口，呢啲嘅擁有嘅財富係當 當時以色列回歸整個國家所擁有嘅。
So apparently, whatever they were counted in, so this represented the wealth of the entire group of Israelites.
所以你會睇到當時嘅人，佢哋都係唔容易嘅情況嘅出現。
So certainly, if you look back that, that number of people with this much of wealth, so, or what they had in their ownership, it was not easy.
連根拔所有嘅財富就係咁多啦。
So because they had uplifted themselves, and this is actually, what they had in terms of
嘅
wealth.
財富，成5萬幾人嘅財富就係咁多啦。
So the wealth of about like 50,000 people right here.
跟住聖經嘅形容，大家係
So here,
聖經嘗試畫咗一個圖畫俾我哋睇。
so certainly in the Bible, we kind of like, share this image of, what it was like.
呢班人翻到當時舊嘅聖殿嘅舊址。
So apparently these group of Israelites, they actually return to the old site of the former temple.
當佢望到聖殿嘅舊址荒蕪，
So apparently once returned, they saw the blissful reality of the temple that they once had.
喺當時佢哋即刻做咗一啲嘅行動。
So immediately, they threw themselves into action.
當佢睇到呢個情況，佢心裏邊被感動。
So once they saw, what was left of their temple, their hearts were moved.
佢被印證。
So somehow, they were moved and touched.
聖經形容到佢哋當時做咗咩嘢？
So in the Bible, there was a description that they took action immediately.
聖經形容到佢哋當時即刻做咗個奉獻。
So in the Bible, it recorded, that they immediately, make an offering.
有金子，有銀子，有祭司嘅禮服。
So these people, they put off to the treasury, gold, silver, and priestly garments.
聖經記載，
So the Bible documented.
多唔多？
Was it a lot?
對比你嘅財富，可能好多，但係唔好忘記，如果對比當時所羅門去建聖殿嘅情況嘅時候，呢度唔係好多。
So certainly, it felt like a lot of wealth, what they had, but compared to the old times when Solomon built the temple, so this was kind of abysmal.
但係聖經記載，
But yet the Bible described.
聖經去 highlight 咗幾樣嘢。
So in the Bible, there were a few highlights.
佢話當時嘅人便為神嘅殿甘心獻上禮物，要
So
做
here
唔做。
it described these Israelites, these people, some of the heads of the family gave free will offerings towards the rebuilding of the house of God on the site.
當時嘅人即刻做呢一個嘅奉獻，係一個唔係我哋預設嘅情況，或者好啦，我哋收一次，而係即時嗰個感動嗰種嘅回應。聖經用 free will， 佢哋甘願去做，冇一種壓力。所以聖經第二個嘅形容講到佢哋量力嘅捐項。
So their immediate response once they learned of the old site of the temple, that they immediately made a free will offering and according, also to their ability.
弟兄姊妹，今日我哋信咗一段嘅時間，我哋對 free will offering 可能我哋有唔同嘅 definition。
So perhaps, as we are trying to understand like free will offering, what does that really mean?
可能我哋參加啲聚會，今日呢個聚會唔收錢㗎，不過我哋完咗收一個 free will offering，即係話俾你聽啊，唔使俾錢。
So somehow, maybe when you attend certain events, that we would say we're not going to collect an offering, but you're free to give and free will offering. So a lot of people then they say, oh, okay, it's free.
Free will offering 嘅背後冇種壓力，等人自己甘心樂意去回應上帝喺你內心裏邊嘅感動。
So free will offering stand as there's no pressure, no designated, amount, but it's in accordance to the person's ability, and how they're being moved by God, to give of an offering.
喺段經文亦都 highlight 咗最後一樣嘢。
So here, in the scripture also, gave a highlight.
聖經話有些族長到了耶路撒冷耶和華殿嘅地方，便為神嘅殿甘心獻上禮物，要重新建築。
So in verse 68, some of the heads of the families, once they arrived at the house, of the Lord, they gave free will offerings towards the rebuilding of the house of
會
God.
留意喺整個第二章好多數點嘅情況，好留意嘅時候，講到族長底下有幾多人。
So certainly, when you look at chapter 2, there was some mentioning, in fact, like, they counted the number of people under, these heads, of
族
families.
長就係嗰個家庭裏邊嘅頭 ，the head of the family。
So this tribe leader, represent head of the families, of these Israelites.
每一個家庭，你嘅 head，你嘅元首，唔知你點分啊？
So
不過係有一個責任，你要帶領個家庭去行喺神嘅心意，去回應上帝嘅心意，去向神嘅心意去回應。
So each head, of the family, would lead and guide, their family, to respond, to God's will.
或者我哋可以咁樣講，點解當時嘅以色列人回歸嘅以色列人，佢哋嗰個靈性去到一個咁高嘅高峰，因為佢哋嘅族長去帶領佢哋行緊一條正確嘅路。
So certainly, why would we later on coin, that, wow, this group of Israelites, they were truly loving God and obeying to God. So it represents the head, of the family. They provided such great leaderships and modeling for, their people in their families, in response to God.
個族長可能佢所捐獻未必係全部佢嘅身家，但係佢帶領佢嗰族嘅人，佢願意去捐獻。
So certainly, these tribe leader, they might not have offered what they all have, but they definitely role model leadership, for the rest of the family.
聖經喺第二章畫咗一個圖畫，當時嗰班嘅人，佢哋願意離開佢哋嘅 comfort zone，佢哋願意去參與緊去建殿嘅工程，佢仲為咗建殿工程，佢作好多方面嘅預備。
So in chapter 2, we learn, this group of Israelites, they were so willing to follow God's will. They uplifted themselves from a place of comfort to return, and they were prepared, in the rebuilding of the house of God. So they were all kind of like really committed.
所羅門建造嘅工程，聖經記載；喺呢度重建嘅聖殿，聖經又記載，兩者都係寶貴。
So certainly, in the Bible, it documented how King Solomon built the temple in the first place, and now here in the book of Ezra, like the rebuilding of the temple, both, of these, activities were really precious.
可能佢哋日後重建嘅聖殿冇所羅門咁輝煌。
Perhaps, the temple that was rebuilt might not match, the temple that Solomon built in the first place.
但佢哋嘅盡力，佢哋嘅擺上，上帝同樣係紀念。
But yet their dedication, their preparation, their effort, God was fully aware.
弟兄姊妹，當我哋話去見好多好啊，我哋好希望將來泊車又好啲嘅你嘅各樣 facility 又好啲，但係弟兄姊妹，今日你為呢一個嘅教會嘅 renovate，我哋可以點樣去預備？
So, but brothers and sisters, perhaps we once, as we started the planning, that, we put out a lot of great intentions that, we wanted the facility, to be better and to allow more people to come and parking. And now, we have come to a point, how are we going to kind of prepare, for this rebuilding?
可能你嘅我哋明白，可能我哋嘅情況同當時嘅人都係唔容易嘅，因為每一個時代嘅人生活都唔容易嘅。
So perhaps, as we look at our own situations, perhaps, it was never easy. It is never easy, even like for us to pursue this.
但係唔容易嘅底下，佢哋都喺個心智、喺個人手、喺奉獻裏邊，佢哋將佢最好嘅獻過俾上帝。
But certainly, in spite of the challenges and the difficulties, but we are also able to commit our attitudes, our hearts and mind, our activities and our offerings, onto the project.
路加福音第21章講到一個窮寡婦嘅奉獻。
So in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, spoke of the poor widow who put in 2 small copper coins.
如果你要留意，其實耶穌去特別觀察嘅時候，特別對比一財主同埋窮寡婦嘅奉獻。
So if you were more discerning, that Jesus, was making a comparison of, the rich man, who put their gifts into the temple treasury, and also this poor widow who also put in her gifts, into the temple treasury.
而耶穌喺當中作咗一個咁樣嘅評論。
Certainly, Jesus also put out a comment onto the actions of these 2 people.
個評論就話呢個窮寡婦所投嘅比眾人還多。第3節。
So in verse 3, Jesus said, hey, this poor widow has put in more than all the others.
點解？
Why?
條數點計？
And how do you kind of arrived at this
the calculation? What kind of math, right?
how do you calculate what is more, what is less?
耶穌跟住俾咗一個嘅解釋，佢話呢一個嘅窮寡婦容許我讀晒第4節。第4節，因為眾人都是自己有餘就拿出來投落奉獻，但係呢個窮寡婦是自己不足，把他一切養生都投上了。
So Jesus provided an answer to why, he would said something earlier. So because Jesus said all these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but this poor widow, she gave out of her poverty. She put in all she had to live on.
呢個窮寡婦佢嘅奉獻唔係因為佢係窮寡婦，而係佢將信心依靠俾咗上帝。
So this poor widow gave not because of what she gave, but in a way, the message was like she didn't even, she put in all she had to live on as an offering, as a gift.
以斯拉記第一章講到神嘅心意。
So in the first chapter of the book of Ezra, it mentioned of the will of God.
以斯拉記嘅第二章講到佢哋點樣去預備。
So in chapter 2 of Ezra, it is depicted how the Israelites prepared themselves to follow.
喺我哋教會，
And in our church,
我哋應該點樣形容？
and how are we, going to speak to our church?
當我哋睇第二章嘅時候，你可以點樣預備喺教會嘅重建嘅裏邊，你可以點樣參與？
So as we have studied chapter 2 of the book of Ezra, now, it relates to our church building. How are you going to participate? How are you going to respond, to what we are undertaking at this time?
喺你嘅心智，
Committing, your attitude,
喺你嘅人手上邊，
committing to the manpower,
喺我哋嗰個嘅奉獻上邊。
and also, committing in preparing the offering for building the temple.
我哋應該點樣回應上帝嘅心意？
So on these three, how are we going to kind of respond to the will of God?